Hello and welcome everyone, my name is Jacob, also known as Rogue Trick. Today we're going to talk about character creation, specifically character story versus character personality. Now you can break these up into smaller components. Character personality can be broken up into voice texture, voice tone, vocabulary, their personality in general, their driving ambitions, and so on. But I think it's good to focus on these two as a focal point, because I think a lot of characters sort of either have one of them or none of them, when optimally you want to have both of them, at least in some regard. So I'm going to use some examples from my characters previously, give you a little bit of their story, and explain how I sort of screwed up most of them, because as a personal failure, I know I'm much better at doing a story than doing a personality that's long-lasting and memorable, and above all, consistent. I think that's a very difficult thing to do, a consistent personality, which isn't just sort of a reflection or projection of yourself onto your character, which to a slight extent everyone does, and there's really no harm in it. But I think my biggest failing with this, or biggest example of doing this, was a character in Shadowrun 5th edition called Cortex. I'm going to do another video on his story because it's a pretty fantastic campaign. I think it was 40 something sessions building up to this massive climax and over a really long period. And of course it's Shadowrun, so it's going to be great. But basically Cortex was a character who had a pretty, I don't want to say compelling story because it was cliche in many forms. You just raise your hand if you've heard of a character who wants revenge as his story. Princess Bride, etc., you know. Basically, he was a decker. If you don't know Shadowrun, I'm gonna keep it brief with all the technobabble. We'll get back to D&D and such. He was a hacker. Basically, he had a his parents weren't really around. He wasn't really checked, and of course, he grew sort of an ego and sort of an attitude because of it. And he thought he couldn't be faulted. He couldn't fail. So he sort of drifted to school, and we did life modules to sort of get the idea of this. And I got a good idea of who he was in terms of what had he done until that point. I think life modules in Shadowrun is very good for that. But so eventually, of course, the inevitable betrayal happens during a run. He gets thrown in prison. His team gets killed, except for the guy who betrayed them. It was this big, burly enforcer dude. And so he's thrown in prison, this sort of scrawny hacker kid. And he also lost his arm in the process. And of course, he swears revenge. So it was very fun to play that character because that's a character who it's very easy for the GM to work that character into the story. Just take the revenge plot, add it into your story, and there you have a character who's invested in the story, who doesn't have to be like, well, I don't really feel like doing that, which please don't do that if you're a player. At least have like a backup. It's the most frustrating shit ever when a player is like, well, my character just has no investment in this. And of course, that's a little bit of a failing on the GM, but when a character specifically says, well, I have no reason to want to do this at all, it's sort of slightly their fault too, because there's always something to be invested in. If not, just the general well-being of people. I know it's pretty vague, but hey, goodness and righteousness and the prevalence of happiness in the realm, I'm not sure. It's lawful good stuff, Anyway, we went through a long campaign with this character, and he was basically just me, but a little bit more, well, a lot cooler, actually. And so the problem is, throughout all of this, we did some interesting runs. We rescued a rich weeb's waifu drone. Don't ask me how he got in that situation. He needed his drone back. It got stolen. He dressed his drones. His I don't remember the name, but there's basically a katana drone which slices things up, and he dressed up his katana drones as maids, and it's Shadowrun. So we went from that to infiltrating a billion Nuyen yacht to these amazing set pieces and escapes and all of that. And throughout all of it, we actually, Cortex specifically, really didn't want to kill anyone, which is pretty out of character in Shadowrun. to be honest. And he stuck to that. And he was very consistent in his decision making and what he wanted to do and everything. The problem is just I could describe him, what he wanted to do, but I couldn't describe him without just sort of describing me. But not even that is fair, because there's a lot of negative ways I could describe me. I don't really know what negative ways I could describe him in, because it was just sort of... Of course, it's sort of the issue, like describing a character negatively also in an RPG, because you always have time to think, which you don't always have in real-life situations, and you can always sort of tweak the imperfections, which everyone, or most people do at least to some extent. And in recent times, I've figured how much fun it is to play with imperfections and flaws. I think it's sort of a rite of passage for each character, or player rather, to figure out that the negative qualities, or the negative feats, whatever equivalent works in your games, is actually a lot more fun than the positive ones. Yeah, the positive ones build your character for the core and its sort of staples and everything, but the negative stuff, that's the memorable stuff, the stuff you have to play with, the stuff that kind of builds a character. But you can have all of that. You can have a compelling backstory about vengeance and love and all those amazing tropes, but it's not really gonna make a character specifically, not a person. So the time I really figured this out was after the campaign was done. Spoilers, he survived, and he got his big revenge, and he didn't have anything else to do after that. You know, there's so many ways to, like, again, for Princess Bride comparison, Inigo Montoya, you can describe him in many ways. Even after he got his revenge, he doesn't cease to exist. And sure, Cortex had many connections, but he didn't really... So the GM asked me, what does he do afterwards? And I couldn't tell him, because his story was done, and he wasn't really tied to any NPC. Like, he had connections with Jackpoint and stuff, and he has, like, friends he'd made, sort of, not really. Like, one-time encounters with NPCs, he had contacts, but it sort of ceased to exist. It doesn't mean that the writing was wrong, he just wasn't a character. So but he ended up being a contact in someone's shop or whatever. I think he ended up being a fixer. But I know that character's not really going to come back in the future, because he's just done. His story is done, and he doesn't exist anymore. As a contrast, I made a highlight of Cedric from Shadow the Demon Lord. Oh, Cedric. Cedric is just personality. He has a story. It's pretty cliched, and I can't tell you because I know my players, or other players and GM, I mean the GM knows the story, but the players watch it. It's pretty cliched. He wants to find runes of power because that's cool. But he's just bursting with personality. But the problem is, or not the problem rather, but that's a character that I say Cedric and they groan in chat because they're, oh, not Cedric. Comparatively, they Cortex and they're like, oh, yeah, that wasn't that the guy with the submarine, and so on. So creating so working with the personality versus the backstory is tricky. I think in terms of working with the story, if you feel like you're way better at creating personality, I feel a writing tip I once got many years ago when I actually wrote things, which I don't want to reread now, oh god, was what does your character want and why can't he have it, is a really good starting point for a character's story, motivation, and things going forward. What does your character want? Revenge. Why can't he have it? Because he sucks. So he had to build himself up and have his epic climactic showdown, which was very anticlimactic. But more on that in a future video, because that is a legendary tale, but in my friends group at least. I think that's a good place to start in terms of how do you create a character story. What does he want? Why can't he have it? And work from there. Just a backstory, it's nice to just have a sea of NPCs for your GM to work with, because that is an easy way for them to integrate you into the plot. I think another issue is just to have this vague hidden backstory your character just never wants to talk about. I've ran into that hundreds of times without possibly even exaggerating that, where every character has a hidden backstory, and even if you try to like poke them to try to like prod to get the story, there's probably something traumatic. They don't want to talk about it, which makes sense. It's not like it's unreasonable to talk about the horrible time that Black Knight killed your family. That would be traumatic, and you wouldn't be like talking about it openly, and you have to earn the respect of like 20 sessions or half the campaign for you to actually talk about it. And the GM can't really like, well, here's a Black Knight, go fight him, because of course, obviously, he's going to be super strong, and it's not really something they can take on. That's possibly just a feeling with D&D too, that levels are just a very big gap you can't work with as much. But that's beside the point. Don't have your story too hidden, or if it is hidden, which is fine. Cortex wasn't boasting about his plans for vengeance. It came up. You know, he never killed anyone, but he wanted to kill that one guy. That was the only one he wanted to kill. But you can make it a lot more interesting than just a vengeance story, of course. And it's very good to have those NPCs or those key locations or events written up and handed to the GM so he can work with it. And also it's important that you yourself try to work for that story. I also have players not actually wanting to participate in their own story. That's very difficult to work with because you have your story, right? Optimally, as a good GM, which you are, of course, you're thinking, here's my story. Before I finish my story, I get the story of the characters. And now I put that in the story, or I take out pieces from my story, put in their story, and it all weaves together. Ultimately, that's how it works, right? But oftentimes, you have your story, and here's their story, you just put it on top of that, and it just exists. Or here's your story, and here are some side stories, right? Optimally, you want it all to flow together, which is really nice. It doesn't always work that way, but it's really nice if it does. It doesn't hurt to have just some side story where they, downtime is really, really good and useful into adding context to a story. But optimally, it wants to flow well. The problem is if the player doesn't actually chase their story or appear interested, that is not going to work out. And that is just sort of something you're going to hope that they chase. Otherwise, you're going to have to make that a main part of the story, which probably doesn't really work with your plans as well. And it's not going to give them that payoff. But that's just sort of a synergy between players and GM you can't work as much with. Just know that as a player, you need to also sort of want the payoff for your story. Not immediately. These things grow, and I would always advise that you have faith in your GM, that they understand that you want your story told and you're interested in it, and they're going to work it into the story somehow. But that's how you do a story, basically. You work on what, again, I'll say it a third time, what do they want? Why can't they have it? Make some NPCs, make some events that are relevant that you can add in. Maybe a city was burnt down and they can mention this, and there can be a discussion in a bar, especially if it's D&D. It's very common, to add humanizing elements to it. A discussion in a bar about it. Just some NPCs, and that could sort of also ease it into the story itself or the setting itself. Because again, the hidden story that the character doesn't want to talk about that happened in one room that only 2 people know about in the entire universe, that story is not going to be told very often. Unfortunately, that's going to end with them saying, I don't want to talk about it. And then they don't. And then it doesn't get talked about at all. And then there's maybe like an off-screen solution. Yeah, it's not very fun. You want the payoff. And yeah, you're not doing this in front of an audience, most likely. I hope you are. That sounds really cool. Like the Critical Role thing, where they're sort of doing it in front of an audience, so they're not just keeping the secret from the players, they're also keeping it from the audience to another sort of really big reveal, which is just a completely different game, in all honesty. Sounds like a really fun way to play it, or rather, I've just never tried it that way, but it does sound pretty fun. But that's not necessarily how you want to do it. Remember that this is between your friends, most likely, and you just sort of want the story to be told at some point. You don't have to be telling them the deepest secrets you have on the first meeting around the campfire, but perhaps just have an opportunity for the story to be told, because that is on you as a writer as well. It is on the GM ultimately, but it is also on you. Events, NPCs, and just have it not be super inaccessible, and the GM will be able to work it into the story. Personality is, depending on who you are, it's either way more difficult or way easier, because personality is often, the difficulty with the personality is very often keeping it consistent and keeping it somewhat not just you. Because it's very easy to be consistently you, depending on who you ask. There's probably some philosophers talking about like everyone has a mask and there's no real you. You exists in different heads of people and there's no perfect version of you. But hey, you're still you, most likely, depending on how philosophical we're getting. But when creating a character, it doesn't hurt to do an exaggerated feature. Again, with Cedric. Cedric is a coward. That is a very defining feature of him, because he knows that he sucks. That's partly Shadow the Demon Lord's fault, because characters just suck in Shadow the Demon Lord, but Cedric is terrible. I was able to mention it to the other players that he applied to be a guard 9 times. He was declined 10 times, because the last time they just said, please don't apply again. This is a preemptive, like, no, just don't. You can't swing a sword. You are too bad. So he has to be, well, resourceful. Go watch that video if you haven't. It's, I can't believe we're still alive in that campaign. Anyway, story, or personality rather. Having one exaggerated feature is not a bad thing, I think. It can be a bad thing if it doesn't grow from there, if it doesn't expand from there, if there's no real central focus that it can kind of expand from. Hopefully organically. Because with some characters, it's sort of just, if they're always angry and that's sort of their thing and it's never going to change, it can kind of be tone deaf slightly. There's a risk of it, at least. But it's a good starting point because it's very easy to keep that consistent. But also remembering that to some extent you want the character's motivations to be based on their story. That's the optimal way it flows together. It doesn't have to be very complicated. Again, I would recommend just doing it rather simply, because a simple, straightforward version is easier to work with for you and for the GM and for the other players. If you're feeling more confident, then yeah, you can work with more complex themes. We got very complex in our Pathfinder Curse of the Crimson Throne, where I played probably one of my more memorable characters over the years, also because the campaign lasted for a very long time. I think we played it for like 2 years. One of the few campaigns I actually finished. Where I had Aldar, who was... It's a very long story who he was, but he was a sort of humorless, cutthroat kind of guy, your stereotypical edgelord, basically. But it's not really doing him justice just to explain it just like that. But that was the baseline, right? I wanted to just play with the edgelord kind of stereotype, which is fun. To some extent, it's just fun being a badass and being very broody about it. But playing a character who is consistently humorless is actually very difficult. I'm not a comedy master, but sometimes I like to crack a few jokes, or even just sort of go in tangents and have fun with it. Being a character who is decidedly blunt, unhappy, doesn't crack jokes, doesn't smile, takes things seriously. Sounds like it could be very stick in the mud, but it also gives us this sort of interesting fish out of water feeling. Depending on the characters. I know you're playing D&D, so probably it's going to be a lot of wisecrackers, depending on your party. But in my case, it's a lot of wisecrackers. And that sort of dichotomy, I think? No, that's not the word I'm looking for. That sort of context, is fun to work with. And it was very fun to work with. That campaign was very depressing because basically everything went to shit. But that's a story for another time. That is a story I'm going to tell as well. I look forward to it. So if we're working on a specific character trait or character personality, is a good way to start. And then letting it organically grow and seeing what you're comfortable with is probably the best way to do it. I think you shouldn't aim for a one-hit wonder. You shouldn't aim for the first session perfect character exactly the way you want it. I don't even know if that's possible. Even the best players, like even the best actors and players, the Critical Role, they change over time, and they're not just saying that you shouldn't change over time. You should, obviously. Even if you do a one-take wonder, your character should have growth and arcs. But maybe they don't land exactly the way you wanted. Or maybe you realize that the accent was a little bit ambitious, and it's better to maybe not do an accent than to do it 20% of the time. It's difficult. It is difficult. I mean, at some point you're playing in front of friends, but you want to have it to be as good as possible to achieve the ultimate goal, which is it lives on forever in your and your friends' memories. And that is the biggest failing with Cortex. He doesn't live on. His actions sort of do. But if I mention Cortex, again, it's going to be that guy, the submarine wars. Yeah, that guy. Meanwhile, there's a great character for personality, Clockwork. This is a character who he was a cyborg, not my character. It was a cyborg sort of rigger in Shadowrun who sent the drones. They was completely mechanized, and he wanted to have mankind evolve over their human flesh vulnerabilities and weaknesses and faults. He was very eccentric, very memorable. And this Russian accent, he absolutely hated mages. And I don't want to say that the player didn't have a story for the character, but it never came up. He probably had a reason for acting the way he did, but it never came up. But that is probably one of the most memorable characters in Shadowrun, or in any game I've ever seen, because he stuck to it. There was something you could mention Clockwork to anyone who played with him, not just in our groups. Hell, my GM has a consistent Shadowrun universe, and you can ask anyone in that Shadowrun universe who has run into Clockwork. They remember him. He's just that memorable. I think that's the ultimate goal, at least for me, or not necessarily the ultimate goal, but that's one of the main goals for making a character, having it live on forever in your stories, having nice stories, having fun ways to remember him, and that is a memorable character. But having the ultimate sort of combination of story and personality, that's the end game. That's something to work towards. I hope I've given you basic ideas on how to create a character. Again, you don't have to have it be perfect. If something doesn't work, speak to your GM, but have it be accessible. In terms of story, have it be accessible for the GM. And even if you want to do something secret, which most characters do. Hell, I think every single character in Critical Role, and I don't want to use Critical Role as a sort of baseline for RPGs, because I think Critical Role, while fantastic and great to watch, and Matthew Mercer is unfucking believable, I don't think that sort of represents your daily home groups that well. Regardless, you can have a hidden backstory. You can have secrets. Hell, I think that's good. That can have some nice reveals. It's actually the most important part is that you play on the other character's secrets. That's just a general role-playing tip, actually. It's really boring if there's no reaction from other players. That's sort of what builds it. If it's revealed that your friend is a changeling and you didn't know, that needs to be a big thing. That needs to be emphasized. If you've been friends forever and it suddenly turns out that they're a shapeshifter and you don't even know their real face, and maybe they've been lying to you all this time, I've been lying to other people. It's just like a big build-up for this. And that's important to remember when you're sort of role-playing. That's your reactions is what creates context to the moment, to the RP in itself. Without good reactions, it's just you writing a story verbally and some other people happen to be listening. But with their reactions, it has weight. And that's sort of the best feeling ever when your actions, people react to it, and you feel like you made an impression. You made something. You made a story. That feeling when you just know that this is a story you're never gonna forget. That's the best feeling ever. And as long as you're happy with the character, eventually, I mean, you don't have to, again, you don't have to have the most difficult backstory or the most complex personality, or even just it doesn't even have to be consistent. Hell, there's nothing wrong with just projecting yourself onto the character. I'm not trying to sound demeaning with this. It really isn't. As long as you're having fun. And that's the big takeaway, as long as you're having fun. But oftentimes it isn't very fun to not have a defined personality for a character or not have a story. Just have them be the guy who went out to seek his fortune as an adventurer. It's probably not going to be fun for you in the long run. If it is, power to you. That is the big takeaway from all of this. As long as you're having fun, you're doing it right. But that's probably my big tips for it. To summary, if you're creating a story, having difficulties with that, what does your character want? Why can't they get it? And what's their plan to get it? Just simple questions like how far they're willing to go. I think alignment did a good thing for this. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of alignment. I'm kind of a fan, not really. I think they add some good RP context for people who aren't as familiar with RP, but I don't think it's really needed. I don't think characters are necessarily easily defined by it, because you change in extreme situations. There's some things you know you would never do, but in some extreme situations you just end up doing it, and that's really hard to define by alignment. But simple questions like their morals and sort of how far they're willing to go for it, and just basic things like mother, father, parents, best friend, sort of their view on law and such. There's good templates outside and on the internet to sort of get a good idea of what you need for a character, but what they want, why they can't have it, and make sure that it is accessible for the GM, because if it isn't, they might not add it at all, or if they do, it's going to be very side plotty. But if you make it accessible and say, hey, this is the baseline, if you want to change something, go for it, or rather, here is something that happened, my character doesn't know what happened, go nuts. And if you're okay with that not being what you expected, then that's super easy for the GM to work with, because that's just saying that, okay, this section of the campaign is just, well, we just switched the names to the names your character is familiar with, right? And there you go. That's the story for a character. Works just fine. And of course, if it doesn't work, you can speak to the GM, especially if it's a secret story. You can speak to the GM and say, hey, this is a little bit too grimdark, edgy for me. Maybe we should do something a little bit more lighthearted, like he wants to find Atlantis, because so-and-so. And why can't he find Atlantis? Well, because it's underwater and he sucks at swimming. Maybe not the best story, but hey, it's a story. Atlantis sounds cool. Personality is, again, more difficult. I feel like personality is something you sort of just know to get into. Some players, of course, are not very comfortable switching accents or pretending to be someone else, and it can always feel goofy. I stand by the fact that the first 30 minutes of every session with a new group is absolutely painful. It is never good RP for me. It's just people are not sure if they can get into characters, sort of feeling what other people are doing, and being a GM in those first 30 minutes is very difficult. Very difficult. But creating a very specifically defined personality trait is a good start, and sort of building it around there and letting it grow organically, and just trying to keep it consistent. And trying and have it not just be you, basically, is a good starting point. Just one trait, really. You can start from there. As long as it's not comically overdone, that one trait, it works. And if you're feeling ambitious, it would be nice to tie it to the story, the backstory of your character. It's probably hard to pinpoint why you as a person act the way you do, but it probably has something to do with your past through a lot of years of experience and people influencing you. But in an RPG, it's easy to say in most cases why you act a certain way you do if you tie it to the backstory. very specific aspects of the personality, like why Cortex wouldn't kill, because he was just a dude who liked hacking stuff. And then he went to prison. And that toughened him up, but he made sure not to lose his humanity via that. Might sound like a pretty small character trait, but in RPGs, that can be a pretty good big one, because most of the time you might be familiar with the term murder hobo. I think it's slightly overused, but the fact that players and characters don't really have that big of an issue with taking life. Sanctity of human life, it's sort of a side thing. We try not to talk about it too much in RPGs. Work with that, because you can easily work with that. Build from a certain personality and let it grow organically, because you will notice what you're not comfortable with when you do it. If you realize that you cannot do a Scottish accent, maybe you shouldn't. If you feel uncomfortable with it, you probably shouldn't. But if you see it as a challenge, Godspeed, you know. I'm not going to stop you. And if you feel like it's going to be fun, go ahead. Just practice, look up some YouTube guides on accents. I do that sometimes before GMing. It sounds hysterical considering how bad I am at accents, but it's still fun. And that's, again, the takeaway. As long as it's fun, that's good. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this rambling. This hopefully gave you somewhat of an idea about the intricacies of story versus personality. It's optimal that the two mix, but it's oftentimes you have a character who either, like Cortex, has a story that sort of drives his actions, but you couldn't really give a defining characteristic except for skilled, which that is not a good characteristic to have as your personality. Or you have characters like Cedric, who I will give the benefit of the doubt, because we are not that far into the campaign, that he is just bursting with personality, but doesn't really have a story except that he's just bad at everything. And then we have Aldar, who had a very defined personality tied to the story, and will probably be remembered for a very long time, along with the other characters in that campaign, of course. And I guess that's what you're aiming for. And as long as you're having fun with it, and you feel like the character is fleshed out and working, then you're doing it right, and keep doing it that way. Take care, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to subscribe. It's gonna be more videos like this, and I am having a lot of fun with this channel, so yeah. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Boosh.